to another video on History by Podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Dieter Roth. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. And for those that are not familiar with Dieter Roth, he received his Bachelor's of Arts from the UNSC Chapel Hill, Master's in Divinity from the Reformed Theological Seminary, and he received his PhD from the University of Edinburgh. He was also rewarded the Habel Theology from Johannes Gutenberg Universität Mainz. He is currently an associate professor at Boston College within the theology department. So with that being said, thank you for joining me today, Dieter Roth.
My problem. It's my pleasure. Thanks for the invitation. So if we're speaking English, Dieter Roth.
Okay.
If we're speaking German, Dieter Roth. One of the kind of dual citizen growing in both countries, but Dieter Roth in English. Yeah.
And thank you for joining me today. Alright, so today's topic is based upon his book titled The Text of Marcions Gospel. I have the History Value Amazon affiliate link in the description below and in the pinned comment as well. So you can go down there and purchase his book on Kindle or get a paperback copy on all from Amazon. If you do it for the affiliate link, it supports me because I get a small commission. So appreciate the support. Okay, so Marcion's Gospel. There's different opinions about how it's reconstructed. There are different scholars, different opinions, like, okay, is it going to be a shorter gospel, is it going to be a medium-sized gospel, or is it going to be huge, depending on which scholar one looks at, studies, and they'll have these different opinions about it, because there are issues reconstructing Marcion's Gospel that I do want to ask you about, get your thoughts on. Before I continue, just in case nobody's ever heard of Marcion before, or hasn't seen any of the previous shows I've done on the channel with other scholars talking about Marcion, give us a brief little introduction as to who is Marcion Synoptic.
So Marcion is, from the perspective of later Orthodox Christianity, Orthodox in the universal sense, a heretic of the 2nd century, mid-2nd century, of significant influence and perceived to be a rather significant threat to the Proto-Orthodox group. We know that both because of the number of individuals who wrote against him and the lengths of the works that they wrote against him. So there's a figure, 2nd century, seems from what we know about him to have made a fundamental distinction between the creator God, the God of the Hebrew Bible, and the Father of Jesus, those being two different deities. He had a negative view of the God of the Hebrew Bible, the God of Israel. Some debate about that, about whether that was a just God or an evil God, but it was not a loving God, God of mercy. That was the Father of Jesus revealed through Jesus. Some other attendant kind of theological implications arising from that, but he did have a religious community, a church. He had authoritative texts, one gospel in some way related to the canonical Gospel of Luke. I'm sure you'll have questions about that. And a 10-letter collection of Paul. In addition, Marcion penned a work that we call the Antitheses, in which he, again, some debate about its exact contents, but minimally did some antithetical placing of passages out of the Hebrew Bible alongside passages out of the New Testament in order to make this argument, see, it's different gods. So, for example, when Israel left Egypt and God tells the Israelites to plunder the Egyptians, take their gold and silver with them, then in the New Testament you're not to steal. Eye for an eye versus turn the other cheek. The prophet calls out the she-bear to maul the young men and kings, and Jesus says, have the little children come to me. So these types of passages that are set in antithetical juxtaposition in order to make this point about the dualism that Marcion has. Marcion was viewed, therefore, as a threat to the Proto-Orthodox for all of those reasons, theologically, Christologically, and also in terms of authoritative texts.
All right, so what do we know about Marcion in terms of how does reconstructing his gospel work? And what is the relationship that it has to the Gospel of Luke?
So one of the major problems that we have with a figure like Marcion, but not only Marcion, essentially anyone that was representing a diverse form of Christianity in the 2nd century, later deemed to be heretical, is that we have, in most instances, almost nothing from those individuals themselves. So in Marcion's case, even though we know about his writings and about the texts that he used in his churches, we don't have any manuscript copies of them. So we have to rely on sources for Marcion. And the major problem with that is all of those sources are not sympathetic to Marcion, to say the least. They are all hostile sources. They are all engaged in a polemical argument with Marcion, and they're writing because they want to refute Marcion, show him to be a danger, to be heretical, to not be consistent with the rule of faith, with the texts that are being received by the proto-Orthodox. So we're faced with the problem of having to think through, sift through hostile sources in order to arrive at information about Marcion. And part of the challenges of that is that, of course, each of those hostile sources also has their own agenda for why they are writing. So Judith Liu, who wrote a wonderful book on Marcion, the construction of a heretic, speaks about, in some ways, there are different Marcions, the different Marcions of the different sources, because Marcion is being presented in a particular light in each of those sources. So we have that challenge. That's where we get the information, but we always have to remember that they are not interested in giving us a dispassionate kind of historical account of this individual. This is who he was, this is what he was about, but they're arguing against him. So that's the case for all of everything that has to do with Marcion, whether that's kind of theological principles, sacraments in his church, organization, all of these types of things. But it also is the case for the texts that Marcion used. We have some things that look like some quotations from the antitheses. Maybe, maybe not. It's a little bit difficult on that grounds, but we do have a couple of authors who interacted with Marcion's texts, again, to refute Marcionite theology, but as best we can tell, did work through or have copies of Marcion's texts that they referenced, quoted from, citations, allusions, references, that give us at least some insight into what was in those texts. So for Marcion's Gospel, that's in the first instance Tertullian. The major source in his book Adversus Martionum, book 4, is devoted to both antitheses and the Gospel. He's a witness, and I have all these statistics in my work on the text of Marcion's Gospel, for over 400 of the just over 450 verses that are attested in the sources, as I understand these early sources and church fathers. We have Epiphanius, who wrote a medicine chest, the Panarion, book 42, chapter 42 is against Marcion, also interacts with the Gospel. Adamantius dialogue, and then a couple of quotations here and there. So that's kind of the situation of the sources. We have some, which is a good thing, but we have to figure out how we read them, interact with them, if we're thinking about constructing or reconstructing Marcion's Gospel. You added a second huge question there about the relationship to canonical Luke, and that is a question that has been very intensely debated during the history of research on Marcion and Marcion's Gospel. Briefly, as if any of this could be really brief, the traditional position is that Marcion edited a copy of what we call canonical Luke. So Luke that we have in the New Testament is very similar to what we have attested for Marcion's Gospel. It is longer. And there are quite a few things that are not present in Marcion's Gospel. And the traditional view, and the view that Tertullian sets forth, or that even earlier heresiologists interacting with Marcion say, Marcion cut them out. And he edited with a knife. He mutilated the text from the perspective that the canonical Luke is the authoritative correct one, and Marcion adulterated it, mutilated it by making these edits. With the advent of modern biblical studies, historical critical studies, starting with Semler and then particularly in the middle of the 19th century in Germany in the Tübingen school, questions started to be raised about, is that actually the case? Was Marcion really editing, mutilating a text, or was he just using a gospel text that he had? Well, it looked kind of like Luke, but wasn't exactly Luke. That was then expanded by the church, right? Or is it something? Well, maybe is it some of both? Right? You had all of these very intense debates in the middle of the 19th century. Then you had two kind of giants of German scholarship, Theodor Zahn, whose massive 2-volume work, Geschichte des Neutestamentlichen Kanons, so the history of the New Testament canon, at the end of the 19th century, and then Adolf von Harnack, who wrote 2 editions on Marcion, 1921 first edition, the second edition, 1924. Both did reconstructions of Marcion's text. Both of them returned to the view that Marcion had edited Luke. And based on that work, that held sway for a certain period of time, always a couple of voices raising questions about that. John Knox at Chicago, and then his student Joseph Tyson, publishing in 2006. But in the past couple of decades, this whole question has become a more lively one in scholarship again, both in terms of questions of reconstructing Marcion's text and the question of its relationship to Luke. So, the short answer, it's debated. The long answer was the one that I just gave for some of those reasons of the challenges that we're faced in trying to think about that question.
I'd like you to expound on what you were mentioning earlier about there being different Marcions. Can you give us a little bit more details on that?
So that kind of arises from the reality that each person writing against Marcion has their own set of concerns in their particular context. They're all writing against Marcion, but they have different reasons for doing so. And their own framework for how they are thinking about the church and authoritative scriptures also has nuances of difference. So that's where some of the types of things that are debated about Marcion is Marcion's conception of the creator God, that creator God is evil, or is it a just God who rigorously enforces, or maybe even in a capricious way, punishes individuals? But is it really evil? How closely is Marcion connected to, in quotes, Gnosticism? What type of connection does Marcion have to philosophy? And you have different church fathers accusing him of being this type of philosopher, this type, and contradictory groups of you can't be all the philosophers. Right? So there's these types of things that are going on in the text. In addition, if we're talking about, it's not so much a different Marcion, but a challenge in the presentation of Marcion's texts is that there are some differences amongst the sources in terms of the phrasing or in terms of the content of Marcion's Gospel. And they also interact with that text in different ways. Tertullian, for instance, in some ways, he's writing a commentary on Marcion's Gospel, moving through it, in order to demonstrate that even on the basis of Marcion's text, which he views to be a mutilated copy of Luke, but even on the basis, from Tertullian's perspective, of that mutilated copy, the Christ that we find in it is still Tertullian's Christ, the Proto-Orthodox Christ. And that's how he actually ends Book 4, miserable Marcion, too bad you tried with your text to get a different Christ, but the Christ of your text is mine. And then he moves to the Pauline epistles in Book 5. Epiphanius is far more interested in making specific observations about what Marcion changed or cut out or removed, right, from his perspective. And so when he goes through the listing, the scholia that he puts together, he has far more references to Marcion excised, Marcion cut, Marcion removed, Marcion changed, which you only on rare occasion find Tertullian doing. He's more interested in using the text as they are to make his arguments against Marcion. Epiphanius is going through and drawing a lot more explicit attention to differences. Now, very often, that which Epiphanius says was not present in Marcion's Gospel is a section that Tertullian skips over in silence, doesn't say anything. So Tertullian's silence kind of matches up with what Epiphanius says isn't there. But Tertullian doesn't draw any attention to it. Only on occasion, right? Like he says the infancy account isn't there. But Epiphanius does a lot more of that. The Adamantius dialogue, which is a later kind of fictitious conversation that takes place between two Marcionites who have different views about how many ultimate principles there are. Is it just two, or is there a third with matter? And all of these types of things as Marcionism has developed over the centuries, where that is in the context of a polemical debate with an orthodox individual and an adjudicator, a judge, who of course always ends up siding against the Marcionites. But the use of the texts in that account is again in a different context with a different set of objectives in interacting with the material. So that's kind of what I mean by these different Marcions. There's the question of the presentation of them in the sources due to their own concerns. But then also for Marcion's Gospel, it requires some thinking about how we deal with the different citations, issue of content, the completeness or lack thereof of what's being presented, because, once again, the interest of these individuals is to present that which is useful for their refutation, not to give us a nice historical insight into who this man was and what his movement was about.
So, which one is taken to be more reliable by scholars, or is there no universal answer? Tertullian or Epiphanius?
So in general, Tertullian is viewed as the main source, and he does he does of course have a very sharp polemical style to him, but he does in many instances give us reason to be fairly confident in material that he is presenting. Epiphanius, he's certainly even more polemical. He has kind of a second tradition about Marcion's time before Rome, that he was the son of a bishop, that he seduced a virgin, that his father excommunicated him, or kind of all that Tertullian doesn't have any information about. When he gets into Marcion's Gospel, he's providing the citations of it. Like I said, a lot of references to what Marcion changed, cut. But there's also quite a bit there that lines up with what we see in Tertullian, even as there are some other things that are different. The Adamantius dialogue has another set of challenges in it, because it appears, and this was part of a doctoral dissertation by Tsutsui, who looked at the Adamantius dialogue, books 1 and 2, and argued, and I think convincingly, that the manuscript tradition of the Adamantius dialogue has gone through a harmonization towards Matthew. So that the citations from Luke have been brought closer to Matthew in that text, which creates some differences and challenges there in terms of thinking about Marcionite readings. But what I would say is all of the sources have to be read critically. And the most important part of that, and here my methodological approach lines up with that of Ulrich Schmid, who in the 1990s wrote a doctoral dissertation on Marcion's Apostolos, on his Pauline letter collection, where he said the first thing we really have to understand about these sources are their citation habits. How do they cite texts? And some of the things that we discover in Tertullian is that where we have multiple citations and we can make comparisons, Tertullian, not surprisingly, because so many were most familiar with Matthew, in instances inclines towards Matthean readings. So if he is referencing Marcion's Gospel, but it's a Matthean reading that we don't really have attested in any of the Lucan manuscript tradition, regardless of what the relationship is between Marcion and Luke, that raises the question, is this coming from Marcion's text, or is this Tertullian's influence because of his citation habits? There's also some theological concerns that Tertullian has. One example that I discussed both in my work and also in an article that I published in Z&W, Zeitschrift für die Neutestamentliche Wissenschaft, on the text of the Lord's Prayer in Marcion's Gospel, is that where Tertullian asks these questions about the Lord's Prayer in Marcion's Gospel, he puts into the passive of not being led into temptation. And so a lot of reconstructions of Marcion's Gospel put that petition into the passive. But the problem is that when Tertullian discusses the Lord's Prayer in his treatise on prayer, he also puts that petition into the passive, for the concern of not wanting to make the deity responsible for leading someone directly into temptation or into testing, tribulation. But a passive construction, do not allow me to be led into, right? Removing the activity. And that, to me, raises a very clear question. Now, when Tertullian is rephrasing these questions and interacting with Marcion's Gospel, is it really a passive construction in Marcion's Gospel? Or is this Tertullian's theological reflection that's influencing how he's talking about the text? And that's something that, from my perspective, we have to do with all of the sources. We have to test and compare citations across the corpus of their works in order to be able to critically reflect on what's going on here when they tell us, right, Marcion says, and then cites it. Well, how accurate is that? And what are the things that we can see, or what are the things that we need to take note of as we're trying to evaluate the accuracy of the citation? And so one of the things that I did in my reconstruction is that I attempted to give levels of certainty to the reconstruction, where I looked at things arising from citation habits, being able to place it in manuscript tradition, other attestation for certain readings, and then assigned a different level of certainty all the way from kind of, we can be quite confident, secure, all the way to, well, a source attests this, but I don't know, I have no idea if that's accurate. And that was just an attempt that I kind of put into that reconstruction to provide some nuance that I hope is helpful for scholars interacting with that reconstruction in terms of at least seeing how I evaluate the level of confidence that we can put for something that a source attests.
So when you look at Marcion's Gospel, do you see something that suggests, okay, Marcion's Gospel is an earlier form of what later becomes Luke, or do you think they're independent one another, or it's a mutilation of Luke? So I've still kind of kept that question open in my scholarship. The reason for that is I've always argued, and this is the argument of the expansion of my doctoral dissertation, which is this Text of Marcion's Gospel book, that the first thing we need to do before we can start making comparisons is work on critically establishing the text. And my reconstruction is one attempt at that. Jason Bedun published an English translation of a reconstruction. Matthias Klinghardt has published two
2-volume German editions and now an English translation of a huge reconstruction. Marcus Vincent has been working on reconstruction. All of our reconstructions are different for a variety of different reasons. We can talk about if anyone is interested in them. But there's still the debate about what does Marcion's Gospel look like? Because the way that we reconstruct that text is going to impact quite significantly the way that we evaluate its relationship to Luke. I would feel confident saying, the kind of that middle part of your question, are they independent of each other? That I think is unlikely. The similarities are there in enough places that and I think this has been universally recognized, there is some type of relationship between what we call Luke and Marcion's Gospel. The precise nature of that relationship is still debated. Here again, I think Judith Liu has done some helpful work in kind of thinking about what's being done with texts in general in the 2nd century. Not just Marcion's Gospel, but just in general in the transmission of texts. And it would not surprise me if there's a little bit of a both and. Marcion probably didn't make all of the changes, excisions that he was accused of making by later heresiologists who were looking at their copy of Luke and saying, aha, right, every difference is because the heretic did something. That's probably not the case. In some instances, it's most definitely not the case because some of the things that we see are part of the textual variation that we have attested in the manuscript tradition for Luke. That it would be far more natural to explain that as this is simply a text critical difference, like we have for manuscripts of Luke. That's what's going on here rather than Marcion changing something. But it's also not unusual in the 2nd century context for the use of a text to also involve some redaction, some changes, some editing, some reframing of texts. And it would not surprise me at all if Marcion were also doing some of that. So I know that some others have very strongly stated their view about that specific relationship. I've stayed a little bit more hesitant to express a definitive view on the relationship because I think there's still some debate about the reconstruction that needs to be done in order to more accurately be able to think about that question. And that's where some of these things of how do we reconstruct Marcion's Gospel, what are the sources for it, that comes into play and is part of the reason why, for instance, Klinghart's reconstruction looks quite a bit different and quite a bit more complete than my reconstruction.
Is there any fragments of Marcion's Gospel that's been found? Like one of the Oxyrhynchus papyrus has been claimed to be a fragment of Marcion's Gospel, and Harnack thinks he saw a Syriac fragment of the beginning of Marcion's Gospel. So there've been a couple of publications, a couple of references to the idea that maybe we have a fragment of something. Part of the problem for that, for me, and if I'm remembering correctly, P69 is the question that Claire Clivat and also Jason Badoon then mentioned. It's of a little section of the Gospel that is unattested in our heresiological sources. So unattested is a term that I use for something that the sources are silent on. My argument in my book is that we should not be reconstructing anything in Marcion's Gospel based on silence of the sources. That was already kind of fill in the blank based on theological proclivity, right? If you look at Harnack or if you look at San or something, right? This definitely wasn't in Marcion's Gospel because Marcion believed XYZ, and there's no way that he could have allowed this to stand, right? That type of argument, well, maybe not. The point is that Marcion clearly had a strategy that looks like both
interpreting extant text differently from the Proto-Orthodox, and maybe making some changes to the text. So whatever he was doing, he wasn't only editing with a knife, like Tertullian talks about. He's also offering interpretations, just like everybody who's reading texts. And it's sometimes a little bit difficult. Well, maybe we can't imagine how the Marcionites could have interpreted a passage, but maybe they did. And if the sources are silent on it, all that I was comfortable in saying is this is unattested, not it was present or absent or kind of providing rationale for it. So that's kind of part of the problem with at least one of the papyrus sources is what are we comparing it to in order to be able to know. From what I have seen up to this point, I don't think there is enough evidence to definitively say that any of these fragments are actually copies of Marcion's Gospel, which is why in my reconstruction and the subsequent work that I've done on Marcion's Gospel, I've continued to work with the heresiological sources, which we've known about for quite a long time, but always hoping that maybe we will find something that can more clearly or more definitively be identified as a fragment of Marcion's Gospel. That would be great.
So to go back to what you were saying earlier about Marcion's Gospel and Luke, you think they're using each other simultaneously, in a sense, and that Marcion might be contributing to the editing of a gospel that already existed.
So I wouldn't say that they are using each other. That would imply a mutual relationship that would be difficult to imagine how that would be occurring simultaneously in both directions. But I would not argue. So Marcus Vincent has argued that Marcion wrote the very first gospel, and that his gospel is the very first gospel written, and the other ones are plagiarizing them. It has some readings of Tertullian that, from my perspective, are problematic. I would not argue that Marcion wrote the very first gospel. So whatever Marcion has is a previously extant text, in my view. What exactly that previously extant text looked like before it became Marcion's Gospel, that's where some of this debate takes place. Did that previously extant text look like canonical Luke, which then became Marcion's Gospel by the edits that he made to it? Was it simply the text that he used, and so this is just the text he had. He did basically no edits to it. Right? Those are the types of questions that, what is the nature of this previously existent gospel? What does it look like? What are its contents? And what did Marcion do with it or to it? That is debated. Vincent being the only person up to this point that has argued that Marcion actually wrote it and actually wrote the very first gospel.
Can you tell us a bit more about the differences of why scholars have different views on reconstructing? Why do they reconstruct it differently? What's happening there?
So there's a couple of different reasons. The one that I had just mentioned was the level of comfortability that a particular scholar had in terms of invoking theological proclivities or reasons for a text being absent or present in Marcion's Gospel. That was a bit of an older model. That can be an issue even if you agree on the sources that you are using. One of the things that has changed in more recent discussions on Marcion's Gospel is that there's been, on the part of some, so Vincent and Klinghardt in particular, a willingness to use evidence from the Lucan manuscript tradition as evidence for Marcion's Gospel. And there's a couple of reasons for that. So for Klinghardt thinks that there was a canonical redaction that took place in the middle of the 2nd century based on David Trobisch's work, originally in German, Endredaktion des Neuen Testaments, translated, kind of the canonical editors created a canonical version, and that Luke's manuscript tradition gives us evidence of both. And those things that Klinghardt views as not being part of that canonical redaction are for him evidence of readings in Marcion's Gospel. Or you can look at Marcus Vincent, who explicitly stated the sources for Marcion's Gospel: Tertullian, Epiphanius, the Adamantius Dialogue, and Codex Beza. Now, Beza is a bilingual Greek-Latin manuscript that is what is called part of the Western tradition of Luke. So Luke and Acts have different textual traditions. It's quite pronounced different in Acts, and especially in certain manuscripts that are called Western. And Luke has some pretty big differences there as well. But what's quite striking in that statement is a manuscript that clearly is not Marcion's Gospel, but that has certain readings that are different from other readings. Vincent calls that a source for Marcion's Gospel. I personally find both of those views rather problematic. Having some conception of what happened in the development of Luke and what we can see in the Lucan textual tradition, and ascribing some of those things to Marcion's Gospel, and using those manuscripts or those readings as evidence for readings in Marcion's Gospel, that to me is methodologically problematic. Those, in my perspective, those manuscripts are not sources for Marcion's Gospel. They can tell us about some things that happened in the textual tradition, but if we're talking about Marcion's Gospel, the sources for Marcion's Gospel are, unfortunately, those polemical heresiologists. There's also some question within that, like, so Jason Badoon uses a section of Pseudo-Ephraim A, where it's a question of, are these references to Marcion's Gospel, right? He kind of really gets into the weeds of some of these sources, but there's some question about what are the sources, how do we use those sources, and then what does Marcion's Gospel look like once we're interacting with those sources. I have a more skeptical view of the methodological approach that Vincent and Klinghardt have employed, which means that my reconstruction looks a bit different. And several of my articles that have been published in different places have kind of dealt with some of these questions, or why I think that the sources remain those church fathers, those heresiologists, and that we have to be very careful about using the Lucan textual tradition in order to reconstruct parts of Marcion's Gospel that are otherwise unattested.
So, given all those issues, would you suggest that Marcion's Gospel could be of any assistance to solving the synoptic problem in relation to Luke, or not really?
That's a bit of a challenging question, right? Because it presupposes some things both about the synoptic problem and about Marcion's Gospel relationship to Luke. In general, here's another place that I have been more skeptical to seeing tremendous new insight or even the solution to the synoptic problem being found in Marcion's Gospel. Right? That's been the presentation of Klinghardt or of Vincent, who have kind of argued Marcion's Gospel is the key to understanding the relationship between the Synoptic Gospels, or even more, all the Gospels. I'm not so sure that's the case. That's in part because some of the arguments that they are making are arising from their conception of the reconstructed text of Marcion's Gospel, which I have some problems with for some of the just mentioned methodological reasons. But I'm also not quite sure that the whole framework for how they're thinking about Marcion's Gospel in the context of the synoptic problem, that we're not quite at that point yet, because that requires a lot of agreement on what Marcion's Gospel specifically, the reading specifically, looked like. Could, however, as we continue to work on specific reconstructions, there be some insight into so-called minor agreements, or where we have something attested for Luke, maybe closer to Matthew, maybe not, maybe it's not a minor agreement, maybe it is. Some of these types of things, can there be some insight that working on gospel texts from the 2nd century provide for the relationship between synoptic gospels or for gospel literature more broadly? Sure. And hopefully we will get some of that. Just at this point, the idea that Marcion's Gospel is the key that unlocks the grand universal theory solution to everything, which is a little bit the sense that I get sometimes in looking at how Vincent or Klinghardt are presenting the importance and significance of Marcion's Gospel. I'd argue it's tremendously significant. There's all kinds of things that have to do with Marcion and Marcion's Gospel, history of Christianity, fourfold gospel, textual job. Sure, tremendously significant. But I'm a little more skeptical that this is the key to the theory of everything, so to speak, that this is what solves all of the problems or the questions that we have about gospel relationships.
So really at the end of the spectrum, we know there's a lot we still don't know about Marcion and Marcion's Gospel, or at least definitely Marcion's Gospel, and that's the issue, is because we lack so many answers that still need to be found.
Part of the problem that we always have in dealing with ancient history, ancient figures, and ancient texts, we'd always like to have more than we have, and we'd like to know more than we do. And part of the historian's job is, with, might even say, a certain amount of critical imagination, work with what we have in order to try to present that which is most likely or most plausible. But of course, whenever we do that, there are attendant methodological questions, source questions, and framework questions. And that's where we still don't have from my view, the level of agreement on what exactly we're doing and with what exactly we're working when we're reconstructing Marcion's Gospel. And that's part of what has led to the current landscape, where there's a resurgence, right? I mean, Klinghardt's in the English translation, work on Marcion's Gospel is booming, right? There has been a resurgence of interest in Marcion. I think that's a great thing, a tremendously significant figure in 2nd century Christianity, and Marcion's Gospel, or Marcion's Pauline letter collection, very significant to keep working on. But there are still some methodological and source and framework questions that we're still debating. A couple of things where there is some renewed consensus. Two things that I have mentioned is that both Klinghardt and I, though we've differed on some elements of reconstruction, agree that some of the places where Tertullian accuses Marcion of having excised something that is in Matthew, or accuses Marcion of having changed a Matthean reading. So I was like, what, if he thinks it's Luke, where's this coming from? Right? Both Klinghardt and I have argued and agree that this is coming from Tertullian viewing the gospel as being fourfold. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John create the gospel. The gospel is fourfold. So he can talk about things having been removed from the gospel in a fourfold conception, rather than, as some have posited in the past, there was a harmonized version of Luke that had Matthean passages in it that Tertullian knows, and that's what he's accusing him of. Right? So we agree on that, and there's been some debate about that, and for all our differences, pretty significant area of agreement. The other is that Harnack argued that Tertullian was using a Latin translation of Marcion's Gospel, which was in Greek. And that affects how, because Tertullian's writing in Latin, interacting with Latin, if he's already using a Latin translation, that affects some things about how you evaluate his citations, and about the place that you see for kind of Marcion's Gospel in the history of the Vetus Latina, right, the Old Latin. But I'm quite skeptical of that. Some others had raised some questions. I wrote a big long article arguing that it's in fact more likely that Tertullian, who knew Greek, was translating ad hoc from a Greek copy, not a Latin translation. That ends up being Klinghart's view as well, which is also a pretty significant thing for dealing with the sources. So there are some areas where we're kind of scholarship has moved to some agreement on a couple of debated issues, at least among some of the figures who are working on Marcion right now, like myself and like Klinghart. But there's some other things that are still open and debated questions about how we actually go about thinking, reconstructing, working with Marcion's Gospel.
Do you see any connections between Marcion's Gospel and the hypothesized Proto-Luke?
So this again goes back to that question that we were talking about before of what did that previously extant text look like for Marcion. Interestingly, in Klinghart's conception of what this text looked like, right, he writes in his work that you could call it Proto-Luke or Proto-Mark or the Ur-Evangelium, but he doesn't want to do all of those things because of the associations that they have in New Testament scholarship. But he thinks that could be an appropriate terminology for it because of his view of what that gospel text is. I personally would shy away from designations proto something because that's already setting up a certain assumption about what the relationship is. Right? Proto-Luke is a version of Luke that's an earlier version of Luke, and right, so I'm not quite sure if that's actually a designation that moves the conversation forward or is helpful. The question remains that general one about how are we conceiving of the text that Marcion received, and how are we thinking about what Marcion did or didn't do with that text. But again, that it's somehow connected to Luke seems to be clear. But again, as I titled one of the articles that I wrote, the devil is in the reconstructed details.
And would you say that a similar problem exists when one tries to associate Marcion's Gospel with Q? Does Marcion's Gospel reflect knowledge of Q directly, or what is the relationship there?
So Marcion's Gospel is not Q the way that it's conceived of in terms of a reconstruction of the second major source alongside of Mark for Matthew and Luke, because it has significantly more narrative sections. Right? I mean, there are a couple of sections in Q as generally understood that have a little bit more narratival elements to it. John the Baptist, question of whether the baptism is there, the healing of the centurion's servant. Some have argued that there's a broader narrative arc across all of Q that's kind of tying it together. Michael Lavan's work on that. But it's more of a collection of teachings and sayings, right? As well as the sayings source, or sayings gospel, or Spruchevangelium, or whatever the designation is along those lines. Predominantly teaching, different from the narratival presentation that we have in Mark. What we have for Marcion's Gospel is not simply a collection of sayings. But again, going back to that question about gospel relationships, could it at some point have some insight into thinking about gospel sources in terms of wording or minor agreements or cue phrasing? Possibly. But I would be hesitant to say that's because of some type of direct connection to Q, but simply because it is sharing as a text that is similar to one of our synoptic gospels, namely Luke. It's sharing in that stream of Jesus tradition that's showing up in a couple of different places, in a couple of different collections.
So when you look at the way that the church fathers characterize Marcion, the way they portray him and heavily criticize him, does Marcion's Gospel, from how you look at it, and Marcion's collection of Paul, reflect how the church fathers describe Marcion's views? Or would you say it doesn't, and that would that infer that Marcion's Gospel, however it originally looked like, same thing with his collection of Paul, pre-existed Marcion?
Yeah, so this is part of where I think it is and remains very important to think about Marcion, even if one thinks that Marcion did edit the texts that he is interacting with, that Marcion is also a reader and an interpreter of them. And so if we kind of a simplistic way we were to say, oh, Marcion thinks the God of Israel and the Hebrew Bible and the Hebrew prophets are all part of the bad side of the spectrum. And that would mean that in the authoritative text that he used, he's going to get rid of all mention of all those figures but when you go and you look at what we have attested for it, some of those figures are there. He has, in the Transfiguration account, Jesus speaking with Moses and Elijah. Why is that there? Why does Jesus speak with Moses and Elijah? But the account is read by Marcion and is understood, and curiously, Tertullian actually agrees on the interpretation, but still has to then disagree with why Marcion is wrong on it, with the idea that that voice that comes from heaven, from the cloud, this is my son, listen to him, is understood to mean listen to Jesus and not to Moses and Elijah. Right? Instead of. But that's not literally what the text says, but that's how it's interpreted. That by listening to Jesus, it means not listening to Moses and Elijah. And that means, look, there's ways in which these figures or these ideas or theological elements that on the surface might be something that Marcion doesn't want, could still be there because he's reading them and using them in a certain way. There are interpretive strategies that are in place. Also, interestingly, as I mentioned before, Tertullian thinks you can read Marcion's Gospel and still end up with Tertullian's Jesus and not Marcion's. So he also seems to think that Marcion did a really poor job of editing the texts because on Tertullian's reading of them, they still support his positions and not Marcion's positions. So the question of what's in the text, what do they support, what do they not support, in part that's a hermeneutical question in terms of how is one reading them. My sense would be that Marcion and Marcionites would read these texts and would find in them confirmation of their beliefs. But I also see a proto-Orthodox Tertullian interacting with that same gospel, reading it differently and coming to a different conclusion. And that's in part because texts don't interpret themselves. There's always someone doing something with a text. And so do I think that everything in Marcion's Gospel lines up with what he believes? Kind of a tricky question. Because it could be read in such a way that it lines up with what he believes, or not. But those are hermeneutical questions rather than textual questions. And of course the problem with that is I'm not quite sure that we can look at that type of element of Marcion's Gospel and then definitively say, aha, see now it was or was not Luke prior to Marcion getting his hands on it.
Does Marcion's Gospel actually omit all these Old Testament references or references to prophecies in the Old Testament from what you gathered? And do you see a similar situation with Paul's letters?
So there are quite a few things that are attested as being absent, right? And so again, in my work, I don't say omitted or excised, or I'm just trying to describe what do the sources say. Attested as present, attested as absent, or unattested are kind of the categories that I use methodologically. So there are passages attested as absent that kind of make sense along this theological lines. Somewhat simplistically, but Sebastian Moll, in his doctoral dissertation, published The Arch Heretic Marcion, he tried to give a couple of principles of editing that explained everything that Marcion removed. And you can say, yeah, kind of take these principles and you can see, yep, this makes sense, this is why it's not there. Right, so there are folks that have tried to do that, to provide explanation for why it's not there because of something that Marcion believed or not. An article that I wrote in a volume of collected essays on prophet, priest, and king was dealt with precisely this question, that there are Old Testament figures or accounts that in some instances are attested as absent, and we understand why. Oh yeah, definitely. But in other instances, there are figures that remain present, like Moses and Elijah, the Transfiguration account, that seem to reveal that it's not just a simple anything that is connected to Israel or from the Christian perspective, the Old Testament, that gets out, that's gone. I don't want that in there. Because there's also this process of interpretation. And so I go through a whole series of passages like that and look at what we have attested for what Marcion is doing with it.
And in my closing question, what would your advice be to those that try to make future endeavors into trying to reconstruct Marcion's Gospel, assuming the evidence that we have remains the way it is?
So, for people interested in Marcion and Marcion's Gospel, I will say very honestly, the first thing to really do is spend a lot of time working on languages. It's very demanding because Tertullian is in Latin, you've got Greek, the modern scholarship, much of it not translated German, you have French, you have a little bit that's now then in our Armenian sources, there's some things in Syriac, all the way into Arabic. You don't have to know all of that, but it is quite demanding in terms of linguistic and philological knowledge to work on a scholarly level. So that's just kind of the prerequisite tools for jumping into serious study of Marcion. The second thing is that I would say it does require critical reflection on methodology and the question of sources. Much of our conversation today has repeatedly returned to this question of how do we access Marcion's Gospel? How do we even think about the text? How do we construct or reconstruct it? And those are a whole bunch of language questions, yes, but also methodological and critical framework questions. And so some time needs to be spent working through the arguments that have been made from those of us working on the text about how we're to think about those components of it. And then, like with any topic, research question that one is interested in, go dig into the literature. Right? Spend some time working through the state of the question, realizing where the conversation is at this point, and then if someone is a doctoral student looking for a dissertation topic, right, there's always one of the great things to look for, if you're looking for that level of a doctoral dissertation, what are the open questions? What are the things that are being talked about? What are the things that's part of scholarly discourse? And where's a point where I can join that conversation? And so there are still things, definitely, in looking at Marcions Gospel, questions of reconstruction, questions of method and sources, where contributions can be made. But of course, to make a contribution, one has to know the state of the field to which one wishes to contribute. Those are a couple of thoughts of ways that one could enter the conversation, and hopefully there are some younger scholars interested in jumping into the Marcion conversation and joining and providing their insights for what, in my opinion, remains a fascinating figure who is located at the crossroads of all kinds of questions in early Christianity, Marcion's Gospel being one of them.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Dieter Roth.
My pleasure. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.